So, Eckhart, because it is so rare for me to get to sit with somebody like yourself, what I'd like to do is ask you some questions about how your perception works. So specifically, after the experience of your awakening, how now do you experience sensory information? And how is it different from before? Sounds, tastes?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. After the kind of shift in consciousness happened, all I knew was that from one day to the next, suddenly everything was peaceful. All sense perceptions happened within a very peaceful field. But I couldn't have said very much at that time except I was anxious, depressed for many years, and now I'm at peace. I could have said that, and I said it, but I don't know why. I also said that many times. I don't understand it. I didn't understand it at all. I didn't realize at the time what had happened was that my thought processes had become reduced. Whereas before my mind was agitated, hyperactive, which is the case with many people these days. And to a large extent, my mind activity was self-torture and continuous projection into future, which of course generates more fear and anxiety. And then suddenly, from living with an agitated mind, living with a very benign mind. And I realized much later that the reason why there was that peace was that my thought processes had become reduced by about 80%. And since then and up to now, the way in which I perceive things, the world, nature, people, is still very much through stillness. In other words, while I perceive, there isn't a lot of mind activity that comments on what I'm perceiving. There isn't a lot of labeling of sense perceptions. They're just there. Not a mental voice saying this, that, that's this, or a mental voice taking a standpoint in relation to what I'm perceiving, a personalized standpoint, my personal relationship to this, what's happening around me at this moment. And then that, of course, is the root of this incessant mind activity, because there is a mind-generated me, a self, which personalizes every experience and interprets and judges and labels and conceptualizes every perception and makes it fit in to its mind-made sense of self and its story, which makes up its identity. And all that is the continuous mental noise. So most people live trapped in the mental noise, and what they perceive is they perceive as if they were looking through a very dense screen of words, images, concepts. In other words, mind activity. And what happened to me after the shift then was that had become reduced to very little. So a lot of the time when I walk around the city or drive, or when I sit with someone, looking at someone, listening to someone, or as I like to do, sit in public places like cafes. I love to just sit and watch people. I also, of course, feel very deeply about nature. To simply be there as an observing presence without the need to call anything or anybody anything. Just allow everything and every being to be as it is. There's nothing I can add to it by interpreting it. Now, many people would not want to go there because they are so identified with thought processes, so they would think, well, the thought-made me would think it would lose itself or lose something very valuable if it stopped interpreting, judging, labeling, because to the mind it seems when I stop all that, I won't know anything anymore. I won't know what's going on anymore. I need to know what's going on. So whenever people meet each other, then there's immediately mental judgments come in, and that's part of the labeling process. And perhaps Jesus was referring to that when he said, judge not. All that's judging is its mind activity, it's labeling. And so it's such a relief to be able to be without that continuous interference. And the amazing thing is that you do not become stupid or unconscious. In fact, you're much more awake in that state than you are in the state of identification with mental noise. So much so that one could almost say, compared to that state of simply being present with what is without compulsively labeling, if you ever should need labels, they'll be there. But when labels are not needed, to a large extent, you're free, or if labels should arise occasionally, they are recognized as mental labels, and you don't necessarily believe in them or are identified with them, so they don't contribute to any sense of self anymore. So it's not that you become unconscious or ignorant, only from the point of view of the thinking mind, which only knows thought. Then yes, one could say that it's like becoming ignorant, but only from the point of view of thought. So with this comes a wonderful realization: there is a vast realm of consciousness beyond thought. Thought is a tiny manifestation of a vast consciousness that is your essence. And most people only know that tiny manifestation. It's not separate, because consciousness embraces everything, is everything. Thought is only a particular form that consciousness takes. So not to be trapped in that anymore, that tiny manifestation of consciousness, not that it will never operate again, no, it can and does still operate, but you're no longer trapped in it, so it doesn't give you your sense of self anymore. It's not there in thought and all the emotions that accompany thought. It's not there where you're seeking your identity or to enhance your identity through adding more content to your mind. And so when that stops, suddenly you realize that you can simply be present here, fully awake, alert, and even know, but not know through concepts or labels. You know without needing words. So there is a deeper knowing that can operate and does operate in that state, in which thought activity can still happen when it's needed. In fact, thought then becomes actually quite inspired, insights, realizations suddenly, because they come out of that field of no thought. When thought becomes trapped in itself, you go round and round and round, and it's a continuous circle of largely useless and, to a large extent, destructive thinking. Psychologists found, even those who are not into anything spiritual, they looked at thought processes and found that something like 98% of our thought processes are completely repetitive. The same things go through mind again and again. And for many people, what they thought 10 years ago, the same thoughts are still going through their mind, conditioned, totally identified with the conditioning of the mind, the conditioned mind. And so you see it in relationships where people act out their conditioning continuously. You can see it with couples. If you had recorded what they quarrel about 5 years ago, you could replay it. It's the same thing they're talking about and quarreling about now. Just one example. So that's to become free of the compulsion to label and ultimately to think. So to realize that it is possible to be conscious without thought, to be awake without thought. And compared to that state of wakefulness, the state of identification with thought is like dream world, like being trapped in a dream. And that's the reason I believe why the word awakening and awake is so important, has been for a long time in spiritual language. Buddhism itself is about being awake. Buddha, the root means the one of that word. It's not a name, it's the root of Buddha means to be awake from Sanskrit. So really Buddha, rather than being a person, Buddha is the state of being awake, a kind of personification of the state of wakefulness, which means not identified with thought. One could say, although all these words are never totally right, rising above thought. One could say the next step in evolution for humankind is to rise above thought, whereas up till now humans have been totally identified with thought. That's the state of unconsciousness, complete unconsciousness.